My name is Andy Smart and I'm going to talk to you about the principles of good research practice. The aim of the lecture is to address some of the key ethical, methodological and practical issues that should be considered at the earliest stages of a research project. The learning outcomes for the session are to understand and critically engage with the following issues in the research process: researcher integrity, ethical principles and practices, engaging with research users, accessing a sample of respondents, and thinking about planning and timelines. In the UK, one of the organisations charged with responsibility for the oversight of research across a range of disciplines is the Research Councils UK, who produce reports and guidelines such as the Policy and Guidelines on Governance of Good Research Conduct, published in 2013. RC UK argues that research integrity underpins the quality and reliability of research, and that its guidelines apply to all individuals involved in research, including researchers, support staff, any applicant to the research councils, the research council staff, peer reviewers, etc. The RC UK states that the onus for research integrity lies both with the researcher, who has to meet the highest standards that could be reasonably expected of them, and with their employing institution to ensure that systems are in place to support and reinforce research integrity. Individual researchers are expected to meet the highest standards of practice in terms of honesty and professionalism. They're required to embed good practice in every aspect of their work, including the interpretation and presentation of research results, the contributions to the peer review process, the training of new researchers, staff or students, and in the conduct of research itself. RC UK states that individual researchers should be guided by the principles of honesty, openness, transparency, and research rigour. For their part, institutions are required to provide an environment in which this can happen. They are required to foster a climate of openness, provide appropriate support and training, including awareness of legislation, provide clear lines of management responsibility, and processes for whistleblowers. A key element in ideas of research integrity is the ethics process, which we will treat separately later on in this lecture. A range of conduct is considered to be inappropriate under ideas about researcher integrity. Some of these issues may be considered to be minor or inadvertent, such as weak procedures or poor documentation, which are correctable through further training. The RC UK, however, focuses on more serious and significant issues such as fabrication, which is the creation of false data, or other aspects of research, including documentation and participant consent, issues about falsification, including the manipulation or selection of data or imagery and or consents, issues with plagiarism, which is the misappropriation or use of other people's ideas or intellectual property or work without acknowledgement or permission. It is also concerned with misrepresentation, be that misrepresentation of data or undeclared self-interest, or misrepresenting one's qualifications or ownership of work. It's also concerned with breaches of the duty of care, particularly where they are deliberate or reckless, including the disclosing of identities or breaching confidentiality, placing people in danger without consent or appropriate safeguards being in place, not taking care to recognise risks or dangers, not observing legal or reasonable ethical requirements. Finally, it is also concerned with how institutions deal with allegations of misconduct and requires that they have appropriate policies and procedures in place. If we now consider specifically questions of ethical practice, ethics is concerned with ideas about what is right and wrong, what ought to be, not what is, but what should be, sometimes called normative questions. Often these are questions about how we should treat others, or how we would like to be treated, what are the right or proper or correct courses of action. The term ethics is often used interchangeably with the term morals, but ethics is usually associated with more formal codes of conduct or written rules where ideas have been codified and written down in a systematic manner. We worry about questions of ethics in research because in the past there have been extreme examples of unethical practice. Quite often these are associated with medical experiments on humans that occurred during the Second World War, but in social sciences other examples are used to illustrate ethical concerns, including Zimbardo's prison experiment, Milgram's authority experiments, and Lord Humphrey's investigations of the tea room trade. However, more than these lurid examples, research ethics is increasingly about professional conduct, questions that surround the responsibilities and the duties of researchers. These can be duties towards participants, but also our duty to the groups to which we belong, the institutions that may employ us, or those who sponsor our research. The concern here is that research is conducted in a proper and correct manner. Questions around protection are usually couched in terms of the rights of research participants. Rights are a cornerstone of modern society, often protected in law, and in research, key rights are the right to choose to participate, the right to be protected from harm, the right to privacy, etc. In research, responsibilities and duties are often tied to professional codes of conduct that offer principles and best practices. In the context of UK education research, this would be things such as the ethical guidelines for education research published by the British Education Research Association. It is important to recognise, however, that such guidelines aren't wholly prescriptive or completely prohibitive. They are guides that recognise the need for negotiation, choice and debate about specific contexts in which research is occurring. This recognises the fact that quite often there are dilemmas and deliberations that occur in terms of research practice and ethics that may result from different thoughts on what is the right or correct practice, clashes of principles, and potentially conflicting interests of different parties. This means that ethical practice is often about making the best possible decision in a particular context to the best of our ability, and codes and guidelines help us make these choices based on underlying principles and values. Ethical research practice requires systems of oversight, including forms to be completed to ensure ethical principles are being applied, and research committees to make judgments about appropriate practice in context. Discussions of specific ethical issues in research usually begin with a list of prohibitions, things that people should not do. However, I want to switch this round and start by reinforcing a positive notion of ethics, something called beneficence, which is the obligation for researchers to maximise the benefits to those that they research. So people undertaking research should actively ask, what are the beneficial consequences of my study? Who might benefit from the research outcomes? This can be couched in questions about utility or the usefulness or application of the research? Is this knowledge that can help build academic capacity, or can the outcomes have implications for policies and practices? Such questions are regarded as increasingly important because as social resources become increasingly limited, there is a recognition of the opportunity cost of research, of funding one project over another. But also in a narrow sense, there is a question of resources in people's time and effort in undertaking or supporting a particular research project. So in terms of the value of research, there is at least an implied duty that findings should be disseminated. This could often be about writing a report or an academic paper, perhaps giving presentations or getting material online. Questions about the value of research should not be underestimated, because value is an important part of the overall equation of ethics, where the benefits of research are weighed against its potential risks. So if we turn to the question of risks, the first of these is potential harm. Researchers have a responsibility to ensure that people who help in their studies don't come to harm from doing so. In educational research, this is often not about physical harm, but potential social, emotional, and psychological harms. These may arise from getting people to talk about emotional, sensitive, or inflammatory topics. Emotional harms can include things such as stress or embarrassment or uncalled for self-knowledge, which may arise from asking participants to reflect on different aspects of their lives or their actions in a way which they may otherwise not have done so. The risks of harm include not only during the research process, but also after the research process as well, although it may be difficult to know or predict if people will suffer as a result of their involvement. In a broader sense, researchers are also called to think about harms to organisations. Educational research can often occur in institutional settings. It may focus on tricky issues or generate inflammatory findings. The issue here is about reputational harm, publishing findings that may damage an institution's or an organisation's worth or standing. Finally, it is necessary to think about the risks to oneself. These may occur from putting oneself in dangerous situations to collect data, or from researching topics which you are personally involved in, such as doing research on depression when one is suffering from depression. Informed consent is the principle that people give their approval, their consent, to participate in research, that they know they're being studied and that they have agreed to take part. There are highly developed protocols for ensuring consent, which involve giving people the fullest possible information about the research, providing this in a written form and in an understandable style, which includes information about the nature and purpose of the study, what will happen to them, and the risks that are involved. It is important to recognise that consent must be voluntary, that people should be free to choose to participate. This could include issues about duress, where people may feel under pressure to participate, and also covers issues about financial inducements, which should be limited or reasonable. Another key component of consent processes is the right to withdraw. Participants should be made clear that they have the right to withdraw from the research process at any point without prejudice or fear of harm or future mistreatment. It is also important that participants are able to make the choice to participate. People who are in recognised vulnerable groups or who are living in situations where they may be at risk may not be considered as competent to make a choice to participate in research. The ideal best practice or gold standard for consent is considered to be a process in which information is given to participants. They are allowed time to read that information, ask questions about it, where the researcher checks that the information is understood, and then the participant signs a consent form to say that they are happy to take part. However, it should be noted that that full process, ending in a signed consent form, may not be appropriate for all research contexts. A third set of common issues in social research surround deception, and in particular the gaining of information by misrepresenting oneself or hiding one's true purpose. Concerns about deception arise where researchers wish to conceal their role, that is, not make the subjects aware of who they are or their purpose. Or it may arise where researchers use deception to mislead participants, where a falsity is perpetrated in order to provoke or facilitate certain responses. Or in a similar but slightly different vein, where the nature of a study is misrepresented in order to facilitate access to a population of interest. In all of these cases, arguments can be made for the necessity of using deception in order to facilitate accurate data collection. However, this does not necessarily mean that deception is appropriate, and the balances of risks and benefits will need to be accounted for if approval is to be given to research which requires deception. The final major ethical issue concerns confidentiality and anonymity. Social research can intrude into people's personal beliefs or their actions. It can intrude into social spaces that people may consider private, or social settings in which confidentiality is of paramount importance. At the basic level, participants may expect to have their privacy respected. If they take part in a research project, they can expect that the personal information about them will not be spread without their control. Indeed, if you collect data from people, you have in the UK legal obligations under the Data Protection Act. People are entitled to know how and why you have stored information, what it will be used for, who will have access to it, and you will be expected to avoid unwarranted release of that information, including release to third parties, which will need to be authorised. Consequently, data collected in research must be secured storely and access to it controlled. This can include both hard copies and electronic files, both of which will need to be stored in a secure manner. However, the point of research is to gather information from people that can be shared with others, so there is a need to look for solutions to ensure that people have their privacy protected. The common answer is to offer people anonymity so that their names are removed or pseudonyms are used in any research reports or public-facing documents. Sometimes, however, research participants may want their identities revealed, and if your research involves participants who want to make their contributions public, this will need careful negotiation. As mentioned earlier, ethics in research is often about debate and deliberation, and some such debates revolve around how to offer adequate protections in circumstances that may have certain ethical risks. For example, there may be problems with giving full disclosure of information to people who are taking part in a research project, as it may affect the validity of their responses, or it may dissuade them from taking part at all. In such situations, there can be debate about how much information is appropriate to give, and the potential for using debriefing to give people additional information about the research after they have been involved. Another example of protections to facilitate research could be around discussing difficult topics which may cause harm. Again, this could involve debriefing participants to ensure they are not unduly upset, and having resources or support to offer to people that are. There are also debates around issues with consent. For example, the circumstances under which consent can be implied rather than signed or written consent, the need to recognise duress in organisational research, and the possibility of getting proxy consent for individuals who do not have the capacity to give consent for themselves. In each of these cases, it may be possible to devise arguments and strategies for undertaking research in ways which continues to minimise the risks of harm to the individuals that are taking part. Finally, there can also be concerns around threats to confidentiality that may arise in situations where promising confidentiality can be extremely tricky. For example, in research that involves particularly specialist or small groups of respondents whose identities may be known to other people working in the same context or field. Similarly, if undertaking action research, it can be particularly difficult to protect the identities of respondents from one another. The solution in these kinds of examples is to be very clear in the information sheet and consent processes about the extent to which confidentiality can be protected. The overarching question in research ethics is about the balance between the benefits of the research, its potential harms, and the protections which are being put into place to avoid potential harm. On Minerva, you will find a link to the British Educational Research Association's ethical guidelines for educational research. Read the items 25, 29 and 30. Think to yourself in what circumstances problems might arise in relation to these, and how you would deal with these kind of issues. Use the discussion board to share your thoughts.